They did not attack the walls. They did not burn the gate. They did not raise their axes and scream. The English opened the town for them. It was early morning when the ships appeared on the river. Not warships at first glance. No shields raised along the sides. No battle lines. Just traders. Low sails. Calm movement. Barrels stacked neatly. Cloth tied down. A few men standing openly on deck. Hands visible. No weapons drawn. The town had seen traders before. Scandinavians were not new. Trade had become routine. Silver moved both ways. Grain for furs. Wool for amber. Nothing unusual. The watchmen on the wooden wall did not ring a bell. They did not close the gate. They sent a runner to the reeve. The reeve came down himself. He counted the ships. 3, not 20. 3 was safe. 3 was manageable. 3 was profitable. The ships docked slowly. Ropes thrown, hands extended, smiles. The first loss happened before anyone realized it. The gate stayed open longer than it should have. The men who stepped onto the dock wore cloaks over their shoulders. Heavy cloaks. Too heavy for spring. But no one searched them. Trade required trust. Suspicion slowed business, and business fed towns. The leader of the traders bowed slightly. He spoke broken Old English. Enough to negotiate, enough to reassure. He brought gifts first. A small chest opened carefully. Silver inside. Real silver. Not a trick. The reeve relaxed. The town relaxed. The second loss happened quietly. More men stepped off the ships than necessary. Not all at once, in pairs, in groups of 3, carrying crates, carrying sacks, carrying nothing. No one counted. The reeve's guards watched but did not intervene. The cloaks remained closed. The traders requested access to the market square. Standard practice. Easier to display goods there. The reeve agreed. The gate remained open to allow transport. That was the third loss. Inside the walls, the Vikings did not rush. They spread. Not fast, not slow. Just enough. One group near the well. One near the gate mechanism, one near the reeve. Their leader never raised his voice. He never signaled, obviously. He simply adjusted his glove. That was enough. Cloaks fell. Axes appeared, not drawn dramatically, just lifted. The reeve died first. Not loudly. A blade across the throat before he could shout. The guards reacted too late. The well was seized. The gate mechanism seized. The fourth loss was water. The fifth loss was escape. The men at the gate dropped the portcullis halfway and jammed it. No one could close it. No one could fully open it. Panic began, but panic is disorganized. The Vikings were not. The townspeople had no formation, no plan for inside attack. Their defense was built for walls. The enemy was already within them. The church bell finally rang, but that was the 6th loss. Sound without structure only spreads fear. A group of townsmen tried to rally in the square. They were cut down quickly, not butchered wildly, removed efficiently. The Vikings did not chase children. They did not burn houses immediately. They secured choke points. The armory was taken next, small, understaffed. The guards inside were not expecting an internal strike. Within minutes, the town's weapons were in foreign hands. The 7th loss was hope. Because now resistance meant fighting armed men while unarmed. The ships by the dock did not leave. They waited. That was intentional. A visible exit. A visible threat. The leader of the Vikings stood in the center of the market square. Calm. He gave one order. The gates were fully opened, not for escape, for the rest of the fleet. Because 3 ships had been enough to take the town. But more ships had been waiting beyond the bend in the river, hidden by the curve. The 8th loss was scale. More sails appeared. This was never trade. It was infiltration. The second wave entered without resistance. By the time the town understood, it no longer belonged to them. No siege, no broken walls. No months of starvation, just trust. The Vikings did not celebrate. They reorganized, they counted, they assigned positions. They knew English reinforcements would come eventually. But they would come to a gate already controlled, to a wall already manned, to a town that now faced inward under new command. The Reeve's body was moved aside. His blood washed quickly from the boards, efficiency, no spectacle. The market square became a command center, the church became storage, the armory became theirs. The townspeople were gathered and counted. Those who resisted were removed. Those who complied were contained. The final loss in the first hour was authority. The town had no one left to give orders. And in a walled settlement, once authority collapses, walls are useless. The Vikings had not taken a town by force. They had stepped into it. And by the time anyone outside realized what had happened, the banners above the wall were already different. This was not the last time they would use this method. But it was the moment England began to understand that the threat was not always at the gate. Sometimes it was smiling at it. The town did not fall in a single breath. It collapsed in stages, and each stage was deliberate. The Vikings did not rush to burn or pillage because destruction was not the objective. Control was. Fire ends value. Control multiplies it. By midday, the docks were sealed. No boats were allowed to leave. Fishermen were pulled back to shore at spear point. Anyone who tried to run was cut down publicly and quickly, not brutally, but visibly. The message was simple. Movement meant death. Stillness meant survival. Fear began to settle into something heavier than panic. It became obedience. The Viking leader ordered the Reeves Hall searched, records taken, ledgers examined. He wanted to know who owed silver, who owned grain, who controlled storage. Conquest was not about rage, it was about systems. They found the keys to the granary within the hour. That was the next critical point. Grain meant winter. Winter meant leverage. The townspeople were assembled in the square again. This time under guard, axes unsheathed and shields interlocked. The leader spoke calmly through a translator taken from among the captured monks. He made no speech about gods or destiny. He simply announced that the town now paid tribute to him. Those who complied would live. Those who did not would not. It was transactional, clean, direct. A young blacksmith attempted to rush a guard from behind. He was killed instantly. No shouting followed. The body was dragged aside. The leader did not react emotionally. He only adjusted his stance and continued speaking. That was the demonstration. Resistance had no narrative here, only consequence. Meanwhile, outside the walls, smoke began to rise from nearby farms. Not random burning, targeted removal of outer support. Any hope that neighboring villagers would quickly organize relief was extinguished before it began. Riders sent earlier by the town had not reached far. Some had been intercepted along the road. The Vikings had not just infiltrated. They had prepared routes, ambush points, fallback lines. This had been studied. The gate guards were replaced by Norsemen before sunset. English faces removed, English commands silenced. The banners changed officially at dusk. A cloth bearing a raven was raised above the wall. Not dramatically, just efficiently. Inside the church, valuables were inventoried. Chalices, candlesticks, decorative crosses, melt value calculated. 2 men were assigned specifically to record weight and division. This was not chaos. It was administration. The captured Reeves clerk was forced to identify wealthier households. Those homes were marked discreetly with charcoal at the door. Later, in smaller groups, Vikings entered and removed silver and weapons. No mass looting, precision extraction. The town began to understand that this was not a raid. It was absorption. By nightfall, the population had been separated. Skilled laborers kept intact. Carpenters, smiths, mill operators. The elderly and infirm were moved aside, guarded but not harmed. They were not worth the effort of cruelty. The children were gathered near the church under watch, not as hostages loudly declared, simply as insurance. The Viking leader walked the wall personally before night settled fully. He inspected sight lines, weak boards, arrow supply. He spoke quietly to his lieutenants. If English forces came within days, they would face their own fortification. If they delayed, tribute collection would stabilize. The river was the artery. Ships now anchored in staggered formation, blocking any attempt from outside vessels to approach without engagement. Fires were lit deliberately along the wall to give the impression of full strength. Numbers were exaggerated through visibility. Psychological projection mattered. Inside the captured town, whispers began. Some men considered coordinated uprising during the night. But coordination requires leaders. Leaders were either dead or bound. The priest attempted to negotiate privately, offering church gold in exchange for autonomy. The Viking leader declined politely. Gold was already counted. Autonomy was not on offer. Around midnight, 2 captured guards tried to flee over a less guarded section of wall. They were seen. They were brought down. Their bodies were hung visibly by morning. Not mutilated, just present. A reminder. The second day began with order, not screams. The market reopened under watch. Trade resumed, but now under different authority. Vikings purchased food using some of the town's own silver. It was intentional. It created confusion. Were they destroyers or rulers? That uncertainty weakened resolve more than violence would have. A message was sent outward through a released merchant. The town had new management. Resistance would lead to its burning. Compliance would keep it intact. This was leverage strategy. A nearby lord would now face a calculation: attack and risk losing a functioning town, or negotiate and preserve it. The Vikings had turned aggression into negotiation power. Inside, they began repairing sections of the wall that had been weak, strengthening what they had taken. This was no temporary occupation. The leader did not sit on a throne. He sat at the Reeves table and studied maps, rivers, roads, neighboring settlements. This town was a foothold, not the prize. The prize was influence across the region, and influence begins with one successful deception. By the end of the second day, the townspeople moved carefully but predictably. Fear had become routine, and routine is the first stage of normalization. The Vikings had pretended to trade. They had taken the town. But more importantly, they had proven something to themselves and to England. Walls meant nothing if the mind inside them was unguarded. The strategy would spread. And the next town would be watching the river, thinking it was prepared. By the third morning, the town no longer looked conquered. It looked reassigned. That illusion was intentional. The Vikings understood that visible devastation invites retaliation, but functional submission invites hesitation. They replaced symbols, not structures. The church bell still rang, but now it rang under their command. The docks operated, but every incoming vessel was inspected by Norse guards. The grain store remained full, but distribution required approval from a man who spoke in a different tongue. The transformation was subtle, and that subtlety was the true violence. Word had already begun spreading across neighboring territories, not of slaughter, but of method. Merchants whispered that the Northmen had entered peacefully, that the gates had opened willingly, that no battering ram had struck the walls. That detail disturbed local lords more than flames would have. Because if trade itself could become a weapon, then every port was vulnerable. Inside the captured town, the Viking leader began a second phase: loyalty extraction. He did not demand immediate allegiance. He created dependency. Fishing rights were granted back to local crews under supervision. Taxes were reduced temporarily to create relief. Disputes among townsfolk were resolved publicly by Norse authority with visible fairness. This was calculated. When justice appears stable, resistance fractures. Some townsmen began quietly rationalizing the change. At least these rulers are decisive. At least the markets remain open. At least the children are unharmed. The Vikings did not correct those thoughts. They cultivated them. Meanwhile, they reorganized defense. Earthworks outside the walls were reinforced. Wooden stakes planted along likely cavalry approaches. Scouts posted along tree lines. The leader anticipated that retaliation would come not immediately, but within a week. English forces needed time to gather. That time was being used carefully. The longships were partially unloaded and rotated in anchoring positions to maintain readiness. Supplies were redistributed. Captured weapons were inspected and assigned to selected locals under watch, forcing them into reluctant collaboration. A man handed a spear to defend his own wall begins to think differently about rebellion. On the fourth day, riders were spotted in the distance. Not an army, observers. The Vikings allowed them to see the town intact. Smoke from hearths, order in the square, guards on walls, no chaos. That image was a message. Attack us and you destroy your own people. It was psychological containment. Inside, tension simmered. A small group of townsmen met secretly in a cellar beneath a cooper's workshop. They debated uprising, they debated waiting, they debated appealing to the nearest lord. But debate without leverage is noise. The Vikings had hostages, food, walls, and momentum. The cellar meeting dissolved without action. The leader knew such gatherings would happen. He did not hunt them aggressively. He waited for desperation to surface clearly, and when it did, he would act decisively. By the fifth day, an English delegation approached under a white banner. Not an army, negotiators. The local lord had chosen calculation over impulse. He demanded explanation. The Viking leader offered one without apology. Trade was attempted. Trade turned opportunity. Opportunity was seized. The town now paid tribute northward. However, he offered terms. Continued local governance under oversight. Protection from rival raids. Reduced pillaging. In exchange, silver, supplies, and formal recognition. The English lord faced a trap disguised as diplomacy. If he refused, he must attack and risk destroying the town. If he accepted, he legitimized the occupation. That was the brilliance of the strategy. Violence had been minimal, but leverage maximal. The delegation requested time. The Vikings allowed it. Confidence radiated from that permission. They were not in a hurry. They were already inside the walls. That night, the leader walked the riverbank alone with 2 guards at distance. He studied current flow, docking patterns, and tidal shifts. This town was not an end. It was a node, a blueprint. If successful, similar tactics could ripple along the coast. Markets could be Trojan horses. Agreements could be doors. He was not thinking about this single conquest. He was imagining a network of influence that required fewer battles and yielded greater stability. Inside the town, something unexpected began to occur. A few younger townsmen approached Norse warriors voluntarily, offering to work in exchange for coin. Curiosity began blending with survival. Cultural friction did not vanish, but it shifted. Stories were exchanged by firelight, weapons inspected, jokes translated awkwardly. The occupation started gaining texture beyond fear. That texture complicated future rebellion. On the 6th day, the English lord returned with a guarded escort. His message was cautious compliance, temporary recognition in exchange for guarantees of safety and shared tribute. It was not surrender, it was containment. But containment was victory enough. The Viking leader accepted with measured calm. A written agreement was drafted by captured clerks and sealed publicly. Witnesses observed. The church bell rang again, this time marking not defeat, but transition. The town had not been burned. It had not been erased. It had been converted. The deception at the gate had triggered a cascade of control without prolonged siege. That was the innovation. That was the lesson that would echo. From that point forward, every English port would look twice at arriving traders. Every gatekeeper would question generosity. But suspicion slows commerce, and slowed commerce weakens economies. The Vikings had inserted doubt into the bloodstream of coastal trade, and doubt spreads faster than fire. The leader stood once more on the wall at sunset, looking out over water that now carried more than ships. It carried reputation. He had pretended to trade, he had taken the town, but more importantly, he had rewritten how conquest could work. Not with brute force alone, but with patience, timing, and the understanding that the strongest walls are not breached from the outside. They are opened from within. The agreement signed in the hall did not end the tension. It refined it. What had begun as deception at the docks now evolved into structured dominance. The Vikings understood something critical. Holding a town through fear alone creates constant rebellion, but holding it through managed normalcy reshapes identity. So they leaned into order. They reopened full trade within controlled parameters. English merchants were allowed to operate, but every major transaction passed through Norse oversight. Silver flowed, and with it came a quiet transformation of power. The town's wealth no longer strengthened only its former lord. It now financed ships that would carry this strategy elsewhere. And that realization gnawed at the English leadership more than any battlefield defeat would have. Because there had been no dramatic loss, no heroic last stand, just a slow, intelligent transfer of leverage. The Viking leader began selecting certain locals for visible collaboration. Not the weakest, the respected ones. A mill owner, a dock supervisor, a former guard captain. Each was offered stability, protection for family, and a share of controlled profits. None of them were told they had become symbols, but they had. When the people saw familiar faces working with the new rulers, resistance blurred into adaptation. Meanwhile, the longships remained docked but not idle. Crews rotated patrols along the river. Small scouting parties moved inland, mapping roads and villages. This was reconnaissance disguised as routine. If retaliation ever escalated beyond diplomacy, they would not be blind. But what surprised the Vikings most was how quickly the town began defending its own occupiers. Rumors spread that rival raiders were considering exploiting the chaos. When a suspicious group was spotted near the tree line, it was local fishermen who first reported it to Norse guards. Protection creates strange alliances. The Viking leader noticed this shift carefully. The town was no longer merely controlled. It was stabilizing under his presence. That stability was dangerous in a different way. The longer it lasted, the more difficult it would be for the English crown to justify reclaiming it without appearing reckless. Weeks passed. Tribute shipments north increased. Not plunder, but structured payments. The optics mattered. This was no smash-and-burn raid. It was a functioning annexation, and that distinction altered the strategic map of the region. Nearby towns tightened gate protocols. Trade slowed along certain routes. Fear of deception forced communities into isolation. Ironically, that isolation weakened their economies and made them more vulnerable to future manipulation. The Vikings had weaponized trust itself. One evening, a messenger arrived from another coastal settlement. Not with threats, but with curiosity. They wanted to know the terms under which this town now operated. They wanted guarantees. They wanted to avoid the same fate. The Viking leader realized the ripple effect had begun. Without launching a second attack, influence was expanding. A demonstration had been enough. But internally, cracks were forming among the Norse ranks. Some warriors grumbled quietly. They had not come south to manage ledgers and supervise grain stores. They had come for glory, for visible dominance, for fire and steel. The leader addressed this directly in the hall one night. He reminded them that silver funds future battles, that stable ports support larger fleets, that one strategically taken town could enable 5 future campaigns. It was not a speech about restraint. It was a speech about scale. Some were convinced, others remained restless. Leadership, he knew, required not only conquering enemies, but managing expectations among his own. Meanwhile, the English lord who had signed the temporary recognition was facing his own unrest. Nobles accused him of weakness. Peasants feared escalation. The longer the town operated under Viking influence without disaster, the more complicated the political narrative became. Was this occupation truly intolerable if markets thrived? Was reclaiming it worth risking destruction? Doubt crept through his court, and doubt is erosion. One night, months after the initial deception, a small uprising attempt finally surfaced. A group of young men, frustrated by humiliation, attempted to sabotage the docks. They were caught quickly. The response was deliberate, not brutal. Public punishment, controlled and symbolic. No mass executions, no indiscriminate retaliation. The leader understood optics better than many kings. Too much violence would reignite unified resistance. Too little would invite further attempts. The balance was surgical. After that, silence settled deeper than before. By the time winter approached, the town's rhythm felt almost normal. Norse guards shared watch rotations with select locals. Children grew accustomed to unfamiliar accents in the marketplace. Trade caravans resumed cautious routes inland. What had begun as deception now resembled integration. And that was the true victory. Because castles can be rebuilt. Walls can be reinforced. But once psychological boundaries are crossed, they rarely fully return. The Viking leader stood again on the docks where it had all started. The same planks, the same river, but the power dynamic had permanently shifted. He had not needed overwhelming force. He had needed timing, discipline, and an understanding of human behavior. People fear chaos more than foreign rule. And he had offered order in exchange for submission. That equation had worked. The lesson spread quietly across both sides of the sea. When Vikings pretended to trade, it was no longer seen as coincidence. It was strategy. And every harbor would now wrestle with a new dilemma. Close your gates and starve your economy, or open them and risk losing your town from the inside. The conquest had not ended with the raising of axes. It had evolved into something far more dangerous. Influence embedded within daily life. Control disguised as cooperation. And as winter winds began to cut across the water, the leader knew this was only the beginning. Because the greatest raids are not the ones remembered for flames. They are remembered for how effortlessly they reshaped the world that followed. Winter did not slow the strategy. It sharpened it. Cold forces clarity. Supplies must be counted precisely. Loyalty must be measured honestly. And threats become easier to predict when movement is limited by frost and mud. The Viking leader used the season not to pause, but to consolidate. Grain stores were inventoried again. Fishing quotas were adjusted to prevent resentment. Norse warriors were rotated back to their ships in intervals, maintaining the illusion that reinforcements were always present, even if actual numbers shifted. Perception of strength mattered as much as strength itself. The English lord, watching from a distance, began receiving reports that disturbed him more than tales of violence would have. The town was functioning. Revenue was stable. Bandit activity along trade roads had decreased under Norse patrols. Merchants were cautiously returning. The narrative he had relied on, that occupation would collapse into chaos, was not materializing. Instead, a different threat emerged: normalization. If people adapt to foreign control without visible suffering, rebellion loses urgency. Inside the town, children now recognized Norse faces as part of daily life. Language began to overlap in marketplaces, not fluently, but functionally. Some locals even began copying aspects of Viking dress. Small details, a cloak clasp, a belt style. Cultural seepage moves quietly. It does not announce itself as surrender. It appears as practicality. Meanwhile, a different tension simmered among the Vikings themselves. The younger warriors who had expected continuous raids grew restless again. Administration did not satisfy ambition. A group approached the leader privately, arguing that momentum should be used to strike deeper inland while English defenses remained uncertain. They feared stagnation more than retaliation. The leader listened but did not immediately agree. Expansion required careful calibration. One failed inland assault could undo months of psychological leverage. Instead, he proposed a demonstration, not a full raid. a limited show of force against a nearby fortified manor known for supporting anti-Norse rhetoric. The objective was not destruction, it was messaging. When the longships moved upriver under frost-covered dawn, the town watched carefully. This was the first offensive action since occupation. The manor's defenders, alerted too late, attempted to close gates, but unlike the previous deception, this encounter was direct. The Vikings attacked openly, but briefly. A rapid breach, targeted capture of the manor's treasury, public removal of its lord, no burning of surrounding farmland. The message was clear: cooperation preserves, opposition isolates. The captured lord was brought back to the occupied town and held visibly under guard for days. Negotiations followed swiftly. Surrounding settlements began sending cautious envoys. Tribute discussions multiplied. The Vikings had expanded influence without launching a full-scale war. Back in the town, the leader allowed his restless warriors to participate in the manor strike, satisfying their need for visible dominance while keeping strategic boundaries intact. Internal cohesion strengthened. External intimidation increased. It was a controlled release of aggression. The English crown, now receiving conflicting reports of stability, of minor raids, of growing Norse networks, faced a dilemma: launch a major campaign and risk legitimizing the Viking foothold by acknowledging its scale, or attempt gradual political containment. Hesitation began shaping response more than outrage, and hesitation buys time. As winter deepened, the river partially froze at its edges. Movement slowed but did not stop. Trade caravans shifted routes. Norse patrols adjusted to inland roads. The occupation entered a quieter but more entrenched phase. One evening, months after the initial infiltration, a former town guard approached the Viking leader voluntarily, not to rebel, to propose something. He suggested strengthening outer earthworks further and offered detailed knowledge of local terrain. It was a pivotal moment. A man who once defended the gate against foreign threat was now advising that threat. The leader accepted his counsel publicly, reinforcing the narrative that loyalty, not origin, defined value. That single gesture deepened the divide among those still considering resistance. If former defenders could adapt, what exactly was left to fight for? The strategy that had begun with cloaked axes now matured into structural entrenchment. The town was no longer merely a captured asset. It was becoming a Norse-aligned hub within England. And that shift altered regional balance, because influence spreads more effectively from within borders than from outside them. Spring would eventually thaw the river. Armies would move more freely. But by then, months of psychological adjustment would have hardened into reality. The English would not be confronting an invader at the gate. They would be confronting an integrated presence embedded in trade, defense, and governance. The leader stood once more at the riverbank where the deception had begun. Ice cracked slowly along the edges. He remembered the first step off the ship, the relaxed reeve, the unsearched cloaks. It had required restraint to delay violence until the precise second. Restraint is often mistaken for weakness. In truth, it is preparation. The success of this town had proven something beyond tactical innovation. It had proven that conquest does not always begin with a roar. Sometimes it begins with an open gate and a handshake. And as word of this method continued spreading along England's coasts, every harbor master faced an impossible calculation. Trust sustains prosperity. Suspicion protects sovereignty. The Vikings had forced England to choose between them. And no wall could solve that dilemma. When the ice finally broke and the river flowed freely again, the real test began. Winter had hidden tension beneath stillness. Spring exposed it. Trade resumed in larger volume. Ships from other English ports approached cautiously, flags raised high, crews visibly unarmed at first sight. Every arrival now carried suspicion. The Vikings searched vessels openly, not brutally, systematically. Word had spread. No harbor wanted to be the next example. The irony was immediate. English towns began closing gates faster, inspecting traders more aggressively, slowing their own commerce in fear of infiltration. The Viking leader observed this ripple effect with measured satisfaction. He had not only taken a town, he had injected paranoia into the bloodstream of coastal England. And paranoia is expensive. It consumes manpower, it disrupts markets, it fractures trust. Inside the occupied settlement, the long-term consequences of the strategy began unfolding in subtle ways. A small group of Norse craftsmen established permanent workshops near the docks. Repairs were no longer temporary. Structures were modified to accommodate longship docking more efficiently. Storage buildings expanded. This was no raid outpost anymore. It was infrastructure. Meanwhile, English elites faced growing pressure. Some nobles argued that decisive military action was overdue. Others warned that destroying a functioning town would alienate nearby settlements that were already balancing fear and pragmatism. The crown hesitated. That hesitation was precisely what the Viking leader had predicted. Direct confrontation would unify England. Strategic ambiguity divided it. Weeks into spring, a larger English force finally approached within visible distance of the town's outer fields. Not a full siege army, but significant enough to test resolve. The Vikings did not retreat behind walls passively. They prepared layered defense. Scouts were positioned beyond visible lines. Earthworks reinforced. Civilians instructed to remain indoors. The English commander rode forward under banner of negotiation, demanding surrender of the town and release of tribute routes. The Viking leader met him outside the gate deliberately, not from atop the wall, face to face. He did not threaten. He did not boast. He presented facts. The town is intact. The markets are active. Attack, and you destroy your own people's livelihood. Withdraw, and tribute continues without bloodshed. It was a calculated confrontation. The English commander hesitated visibly. His men were prepared for battle, not for political complexity. To attack would be straightforward militarily, but disastrous economically. To withdraw would look weak. After hours of tense standoff, the English force pulled back to regroup. No arrows loosed, no gates breached. The Vikings had survived their first external test not through force, but through leverage. Inside the town, morale among Norse warriors surged. The method had held. But the leader knew complacency was fatal. He increased patrol frequency, rotated command positions to prevent stagnation, encouraged limited cultural exchange events in controlled settings, feasts with selected locals under supervision. Not celebration, calibration. The longer the occupation felt stable, the harder it would be to dislodge. However, a deeper challenge emerged. Younger Englishmen who had grown up during the occupation began viewing Norse presence not as invasion, but as reality. That shift alarmed both English loyalists and Viking hardliners. Identity was mutating. Some Norse warriors feared dilution. Some English elders feared erasure. The leader addressed his own men again. He reminded them that expansion requires adaptation, that influence spreads strongest when it embeds. Purity without power is isolation. Power with integration becomes legacy. Meanwhile, trade routes north expanded further. The occupied town became a gateway not just for raids, but for structured exchange between Scandinavia and England. Silver flowed north in steady streams. Timber and grain flowed south in return. The economic symbiosis complicated the political narrative further. What had begun as deception had matured into interdependence. Yet danger lingered. A coordinated rebellion could still ignite if external forces unified decisively. The leader remained vigilant for signs of cross-regional alliance. Messages intercepted along roadways suggested growing frustration among English lords. Plans were whispered of assembling a coalition large enough to overwhelm the settlement in a single, overwhelming strike. The leader responded not by fortifying alone, but by expanding diplomacy. Envoys were sent to rival English factions offering trade privileges in exchange for neutrality. Division was encouraged deliberately. Unity among enemies is the greatest threat. By late spring, the town no longer resembled a captured prize. It resembled a strategic hinge. Ships bearing Norse banners came and went routinely. English merchants negotiated under Norse oversight. Tribute agreements expanded beyond the initial settlement. The method had evolved from singular tactic to regional model. But beneath the surface, the leader understood something fundamental. This success was fragile. It depended on discipline, on restraint, on constant recalculation of risk. One impulsive massacre, one arrogant misstep, one misjudged show of dominance could collapse months of careful positioning. That awareness kept him cautious. As summer approached, he stood again at the docks where it had all begun. The planks had been reinforced, the river busier than ever. He remembered the first moment when cloaks fell and axes appeared. That second had defined everything that followed. But the greater conquest had not been in that instant. It had been in every measured decision afterward. When Vikings pretended to trade, they did more than seize a town. They demonstrated that warfare could begin with patience. That conquest could wear the face of commerce, and that the most powerful invasions are not always the loudest. The gates of England had not been shattered. They had been persuaded open. And once a gate has opened willingly, it never closes with the same confidence again. Summer did not bring relief. It brought visibility. The river carried more traffic than ever, and with it came observers, envoys, spies. The deception that had opened the gate months earlier was no longer a secret tactic whispered in fear. It was a known possibility, and that knowledge changed the battlefield permanently. Every English port now scanned sails differently. Every reeve questioned traders longer. Suspicion became routine, but routine suspicion carries a cost. Trade slowed across the coastline. Markets tightened. Revenue dipped in towns that had not been touched by Norse hands. Fear had become self-inflicted damage. The Viking leader understood the deeper consequence of what he had done. He had forced England into defensive posture not only militarily, but economically. The occupied town, meanwhile, grew stronger under contrast. While neighboring ports hesitated and delayed commerce, this settlement operated with structured confidence. Ships arrived under clear rules. Inspections were predictable. Tribute was calculated, not improvised. Merchants, always practical, began preferring stability over patriotic resentment. Silver does not care who rules a dock, only that the dock functions. This shift began pulling influence inward like a tide. The English crown, watching revenue streams fragment and political pressure mount, faced an uncomfortable truth. The town was no longer merely captured. It was competitive. To retake it by force would risk collapsing one of the few coastal markets still operating efficiently. Delay, however, allowed Norse entrenchment to deepen. It was a strategic stalemate born not of battlefield parity, but of psychological inversion. The Vikings had reversed the traditional siege dynamic. Instead of starving inside walls, they allowed the outside world to starve itself through overcorrection. Inside the settlement, a new generation was forming perceptions not defined by invasion, but by coexistence. Children who had watched cloaks fall months earlier now saw Norse guards as part of daily rhythm. Language blended more fluidly in the market square. A Norse blacksmith trained an English apprentice. A former town guard supervised patrol shifts alongside a Viking warrior. These interactions were not sentimental. They were structural. They made reversal harder with each passing season. Yet danger never disappeared. Reports reached the leader that a coalition of English lords was finally consolidating, not out of outrage, but out of fear that this method would replicate further south. The coalition planned a decisive campaign aimed not merely at recapturing the town, but at eliminating its Norse command entirely. This was the escalation he had anticipated from the beginning. The leader did not panic. He recalibrated. Supplies were stockpiled aggressively. Non-essential civilians were quietly relocated to outer villages under supervision to reduce internal strain. Scouts extended their range deeper inland to monitor coalition movements. Diplomacy intensified with rival English factions who distrusted the emerging coalition. divide before impact. That remained the principle. Weeks later, the coalition army approached in numbers large enough to end ambiguity. This was no negotiation party. Banners visible, armor reflecting sun. Intent unmistakable. The Vikings did not attempt deception this time. The gates remained closed. Archers lined the walls. Earthworks reinforced. The town that had been taken without siege now prepared to survive one. But the difference lay in timing. Months of preparation had strengthened defenses beyond what the English remembered. The coalition faced not a fresh conquest, but a fortified position integrated with its own supply networks. The first assault tested outer barriers and withdrew quickly under disciplined Norse resistance. The second assault tried to cut off river access, but long ships repositioned strategically, preventing blockade. Days stretched into weeks. The coalition had numbers. The Vikings had preparation and interior supply lines stabilized months prior. Frustration mounted among English ranks. Why had this been allowed to grow so strong? Why had immediate retaliation not occurred earlier? Doubt crept inward. Internal blame surfaced. Meanwhile, the Viking leader maintained strict discipline within walls. No reckless sallies, no dramatic countercharges, controlled defense only. Every failed assault drained English morale further. Eventually, coalition unity fractured. One lord withdrew citing crop protection needs. Another cited mounting costs. The Crown's representative hesitated between persistence and practicality. The siege dissolved not with triumphal charge, but with erosion of resolve. The coalition retreated. The town remained Norse-aligned. The deception that had begun with cloaked axes had matured into defended sovereignty. The leader stood once more atop the wall as the last English banners disappeared over distant hills. He understood that this victory was not about battlefield dominance alone. It was about sequence. First deception, then control, then normalization, then preparation. The method had forced England into reactive posture at every stage. They had responded late, hesitated early, and fractured under pressure. The gates had been opened by trust. They had remained closed by discipline. From that summer onward, the story of the town spread far beyond its riverbanks. Not as a tale of massacre, but as a warning. When Vikings pretended to trade, they did not merely seize opportunity, they redefined entry. And England would never again look at an arriving merchant ship without remembering how a handshake had once become a conquest. The lesson was permanent. Walls defend against force. They do not defend against patience. And in that patience lay the most dangerous weapon the Vikings carried across the sea.